time has just gone 33 minutes past 9. Let's bring you up to date with the stories making the front pages of the papers today.
And the IIII covers the escalating train strikes, with thousands to be balloted again under a new tactic to increase the number of major walkouts across the whole network.
The Mail has an exclusive. Union Barons have launched a loyalty card scheme for strikers, designed, it claims, to artificially swell picket line numbers.
And a story we'll be covering in a moment. The Telegraph says the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst is today urged to tackle an allegedly toxic culture of sexual assault embedded within the institution.
The Express says thousands of vulnerable cancer patients are being stranded in isolation without support during the cost of living crisis.
And The Guardian says hundreds of voluntary organisations have been forced to shut or scale back operations because of government delays in replacing EU funding.
Let's delve into the papers in some more depth now, shall we? And joining us the last time this morning is political editor of Sunday People, Nigel Nelson, and former Conservative advisor Claire Pearsall. A real-life married couple, everybody, watching and listening at home. Differing political opinions, which makes for great TV and a great paper review. So let's go again, shall we? Round three. Yep. Claire, let's start with the Telegraph, shall we? And this quite shocking story about a toxic culture at Sandhurst.
It is, and I think we need to all remember that it was only in 1984 that Sandhurst admitted women. So prior to that, it had always been a male institution. The armed forces themselves had been very, very heavily male-dominated. And it's the one unfortunate fact that the MOD and all of the armed forces together haven't quite figured out how to deal with women and sexual assault and rape in parts of their institutions. And this is quite serious when you look at the numbers. And there is a lady here, Paula Edwards, Chief Executive of Salute Her UK, which is a charity looking after women in the armed forces, that said that 3,170 women on its database, more than half of those have been raped during their time in the armed forces. Now, there will be some who say, oh, well, it's just banter and it's not always sexual assault, it's just being one of the lads. But I think that that is half of the problem, that it isn't just banter. These are serious sexual assaults. Women want to be taken seriously in their career in the armed forces. They are very good at their careers, but they are treated almost as if they are trophies to some of the cadets when they're in training. And I think that's the problem. That attitude hasn't left certain parts of training. It needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with quickly. Predatory behaviour shouldn't be allowed. These are professionals, and whether they be a man or a woman, they are there to serve their country, and they need to be listened to. They need to be believed, and it needs to be dealt with.
I think we can all agree with that, can't we, Nigel? Another story, let's move on to yours now. This is on the front page of the Times. Another sex scandal, it seems. British MPs on a visit to a foreign state were met at their hotel by sex workers.
Yes, well, apparently this is not too unusual. The worry here was the MPs might be blackmailed because of it, but what these are all party parliamentary groups, which are only semi-official groups of MPs who get together with a particular interest. It can be anything from cycling to Botswana, whatever it might be. We got 700 of these things, and the MPs go off travelling abroad. Now, Claire and myself have been working in the House of Commons for years, so we've heard many tales of bad behaviour on these trips. Most MPs behave themselves, they go there for a fact finder, they do the job. Some don't. Some get drunk, some use prostitutes. As a result, there's this warning that they could be blackmailed because of it. I mean, really, when you think about quite so many MPs' groups who obviously might well be paid for by somebody else for these trips, which actually sets up another problem. It looks like that some of them are going off on effectively 18 to 30 holidays, and they tend to be between their 50s and 60s.
Right. Are these Are these taxpayer jollies? Are these paid for by the taxpayers and then they're going over there and getting up to this sort of nonsense?
No, they're not. No, I mean they're paid for by sponsors, which in itself can be a bit of a problem. We've had a bit of that with Qatar, for instance. There is an APPG on Qatar. So you also have then the select committees, the ones who look after legislation and shadow the departments. When they go on trips, they are paid by the taxpayer. These particular ones, no.
Well, I was an MEP for a while, and all I got was a box of chocolates on occasional trips. So there we go. I must be, leading a clean life. Let's be honest, Claire. To the Telegraph. Now, this is an extraordinary story. We've been talking about this throughout the morning about effective tax rates of at least 80% and as high as 96%. That could hit some middle-class families. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, this is the problem with our very complicated taxation system and where you have a crossover with the state benefit system. And what George Osborne did, if we all remember back in the day, to change the what was the old family allowance, which became child benefit, he decided that it wasn't to be a universal benefit anymore, and you would taper off as soon as you started earning over 50,000. Now that rate has been frozen, and unfortunately, where people's wages have increased, whether they've got another job, it's dragging more and more people into the tax threshold, where they will lose things like child benefit, and if they are in receipt of any universal credit, which some families in £50,000 will be if their childcare costs are extortionate, then you start to have this perfect storm of being taxed higher, as much as 96%, which is unbelievable in this day and age.
That's sort of 1970s style tax.
It certainly is. This is a majority of people's salaries now being lost, and it's just the government hasn't quite ironed out some of those problems. I think that if they don't do it, you are going to see more and more people, at least 90,000 families by about 2030, dragged into this, which is going to be some really difficult conditions for a lot of people who aren't earning huge amounts of money. And this has been a problem ever since it was introduced, this taper off of child benefit, where you have a single parent family earning just over the threshold, loses child benefit. Two families earning £49,000 each, two earners in one family, they still get to keep it. There has always been that kind of discrepancy. This is just making it worse, and it is a bit of a little perfect storm here for, and the Resolution Foundation are quite right to point this out, and it does need to be looked at.
And a perfect storm as well, if you think of the context of it all, with the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's impacting middle-class families, where perhaps these are families that have never suffered before, working families struggling to put food on the table, and then you take into account these tax benefits being removed as well. I mean, it's going to impact people that have never had to worry about these things
there's
before.
a different study which is showing that because of of people being dragged into higher tax rates, that even if you're on average earnings, say about 33,000, you stand to lose 8,000 more in tax over the next decade. And that's these weren't spelled out when Jeremy Hunt unveiled his budget, but that's the actual financial cost of what he was doing.
Do you sometimes think, Nigel and Claire, that we voted for Boris, we got Rishi through Liz, but we've ended up with taxation that sounds like Corbynism.
Well, to an extent it is. I mean, I have to say that I was amazed during the pandemic when Rishi Sunak, in fact, adopted John McDonnell's budget effectively, spending £400 billion during COVID. And certainly you're right. At the moment, what they're trying to do is just recoup money. They've got to get some money back because the finances are in such a terrible state. But yes, I mean, in a sense, that budget was something that Labour could have delivered.
And I wonder if man and wife, as it were, different sides of the political spectrum. But is part of the problem, Claire, is that all of the political parties just look and feel and sound the same?
I think that is one of the problems at the moment. You can't really get a sort of cigarette paper between all of them. There is enormous crossover. As Nigel said, the budget that we had during COVID was something Jeremy Corbyn would have been proud of, and we seem to be following the Labour Party on absolutely everything at the moment. and as a Conservative, that's really hard to
So how do we get
square
out of this?
off.
How do the Tories put some sensible policies forward that does away with this nonsense? What about net zero?
I would like to see that go, and I think the majority of voters would also like to see that go. You need to get Brexit through and done properly. You start to reduce taxes. Those are the things that Conservatives want. Liz Truss, I think, went about it too quickly.
Yep.
I think some of her plans were very good, very interesting, very innovative, but I think it was just too much too soon. But we can't keep playing catch up to the Labour Party. They put something out there and we take it as ours, because that isn't Conservative policy making. And Labour also needs to actually come back with some kind of opposition, because we don't actually see what they stand for at the moment. There's a face being pulled at me down the other end of the table, but the policies aren't there.
It was your remark about Liz Truss that, Liz Truss's budget was completely and utterly bonkers. And the whole point of that was that when the markets reacted the way they did, this wasn't a political kind of gesture by them. All they care about is actually making profit, making money, and they realised the budget was such a disaster that Britain wasn't worth investing in. So, Liz Truss, I don't think one can suggest that any of it was on the right track.
But don't you think, looking back though, the actual amount of money that Truss was pumping into the economy was about 4 billion quid? Now, people on the political left are after many, many multiples of that to pay nurses and to pay. So
where's it coming from?
Yeah, where's that money coming? If we couldn't find £4 billion for those tax cuts, where the heck are we going to find all these untold billions to pay nurses and the RMT?
But that was the whole point of Liz Truss's budget, that when she was trying to cut taxes at a time when taxes really shouldn't be cut, I don't even think the Labour Party certainly the Labour Party wouldn't have done that. But the real problem was it was never costed. That fundamental mistake of not getting the Office of Budget Responsibility report in, which would have told her whether or not this was a goer. I suspect the reason it didn't come through is because it wasn't a goer, and the markets then reacted the way they did.
But I think that does highlight the problem, though, is that where does the opposition go? If they want to fund the NHS to the tune of God knows how many millions more, and railway workers and paramedics and, where does that money come from? Because I haven't seen anything laid out from the Labour Party that would suggest they have a plan for making that happen, other than increasing taxes than they are already.
Your lot nicked the windfall tax that Labour put forward. When it comes to the health service, they're talking about getting rid of non-dom status. That would raise about £1.6 billion for the health service. So there are other things out there that you could actually get the money from.
Is this what the dinner table is?
Yeah.
It
all
is,
the time.
doesn't it?
Actually, it brings us quite neatly onto the next story.
Yes, it does.
In the eye here, this is one of yours, Nigel. Make a plan for breakups before buying a house together, says Vicky Spratt. This seems a bit depressing. Plan for your demise before you even get going as a couple.
It's actually quite good advice, really. Although not in our case. I'd never be able to work the TV remote by myself. And where I would get my political stories from without Claire, I've no idea. But what this actually is, it's more about cohabitation. And I think this is the next big thing that legislation has to tackle, to actually give cohabiting couples proper rights. One of the suggestions here in the eye is that you actually have a contract drawn up when you first get together, which doesn't sound terribly romantic. But the problem is there's no such thing as common law marriage, and people think that there is. There's nothing in law about that. And as a result, if you break up and you're just living with somebody, you have no rights whatsoever. So whoever owns the house, they will take the whole lot. And one of the things that really that politicians now need to do is come out with proper laws to cover cohabitation, so people will have some rights.
Well, Ellie, you're a bit younger than the rest of us on this panel, if you don't mind me saying so. I don't want to misage you, but if a fella came into your life, or you have one in your life, and he said, right, we're going to get together, but here's a prenup, sign this. How would that make you feel?
Well, it's not very romantic, is it?
No, it's not.
I agree with you, Nigel. But you know what? A lot of my friends are having this conversation with their other halves now, because you cannot afford to buy by yourself. You just can't.
Yeah.
So you do need to buy with that second person to enable to get a mortgage to afford anything. That's just the reality of it. So it's how you tackle that. And people are coming in on different salaries, and people are putting down a lot more than perhaps the other it is messy. It's really, really difficult. I actually think Vicky Spratt has got a plan here in this article, basically saying you need to just work it out, really, until it is enshrined in law, what you do as a couple. I think it just ultimately comes down to what you think is best. I mean,
It is like a prenup.
yeah, it is like a
effectively.
prenup, but
Yeah.
it's like in sometimes the early stages of dating. I mean, but that's the reality because people can't afford to buy about
It is, and it's a very harsh reality, but it actually just then takes all of that problem away should you break up, which those of us that have been through a divorce at this table know how painful that is. But I think if you have this contract drawn up, there are no disagreements. If you split, you've got something written that states that you're having, it's split 60-40, 30-70, whatever the split is, and whoever's taking the cat or the dog or the goldfish, it's there and everybody knows where they stand. So it takes that horrible emotional pull out of it, which when you go through a divorce, the financial settlement is always very, very painful. So I think anything that can minimise that has got to be a good thing.
Well, hopefully, Claire, Nigel, thank you for joining us this morning together. As good, there won't be another divorce amongst you
on the
pair.
cards, no.
I'm delighted. Delighted that we got you in as
it's been
couple.
great fun.
Broken your duck.
Thank you.
And hopefully you'll be a double out for many, many
Hope
more
so.
periods.
Hope so. No, good fun, thank
It's
you.
been great fun. Thanks for coming in today.